Good evening and welcome everybody to this talk about Ludwig Meinardus' Oratorio, Luther. Just to remind everybody that this is being recorded, this event. So if you later on want to ask something or contribute to our discussion, that might then feature later in the public. And also remind everybody, please, to mute themselves for the duration of the talk. And afterwards, again, I'll ask you then, or welcome you to say something and ask questions or share your views of the piece. You see me there, I'm facing a window here with the evening sun shining in. And we just experimented a bit with that. So I have the sun in my face and you'll probably see it over the course of the evening going around a bit. But the alternative with the blinds down would make the whole thing extremely dark. And most of the time you will see me just in the corner like a moment ago in the top right corner anyway. So this is the second webinar. We had one 2 weeks ago. The Lutheran Church of Ireland hosted a discussion and also talks about this event. Luther in Worms is of course a something that many people may not have to that extent on their radar, as it were. The 500-year anniversary of the Reformation is usually and rightly associated with 1517 and was celebrated, commemorated at that point. But of course, it's always helpful to have a single day, a single moment to tie something to. But in reality, this was an extended process. And what Luther did in 1517 was he questioned or pointed out things that were going wrong in the church in his view, and also in that of many others, as it turned out. But he at that point didn't envisage that there would be a new church, a split of the existing church. This was a process that took for a few years. And essentially what happened in Worms in April 1521 was at that point, it became entirely clear that there would not be a chance for a reform within the church as he wanted it. And that meant that from then on, there were then developments towards developing his own views and his own denomination. And so far, this is an important event. What you just heard there was music from the beginning of the second part of this oratorio. This is the beginning of the actual Diet of Worms as Luther gets there and enters there, but it's actually the entrance of the Emperor Charles V. And there's a beginning of the event before Luther then joins them. So that was a very festive, brass-heavy music that suits that occasion. What I will do now is I will go through a little bit of the historical context first, then about what actually happened at the Diet, as far as we know, then about the oratorio and its structure, and then we look at a number of extracts from the oratorio that I've selected to give you an impression of the different types of music that feature in there, as well as the specific emphasis that Meinardus and with him probably a lot of Germans at the time put on this stuff, because you can look at it from different angles and they picked a very specific one. So let's go back then to the slides, just a moment. So the context. The story actually starts about 100 years earlier, when in 1415 the Council of Constance took place, and an earlier reformer of the church, the Bohemian Jan Hus, was invited, given safe conduct by the then Emperor Sigismund, to actually make his case, what he thought was wrong with the church in Constance. But when on arrival, was actually eventually then condemned by the council and by the emperor of heresy and burned at the stake. And that is something that was on everybody's mind when now, a bit more than 100 years later, a similar situation arose around Luther, who was offered safe conduct to come to Worms and make his case or talk to the emperor and to representatives of the empire, but also of the clergy. Now, as I said earlier, we normally associate the 31st of October, Reformation Day, with, there we go, with the beginning of the Reformation, when the 95 Theses were nailed at the portal of the Wittenberg Church, All Saints, or the Castle Church, also known as. And there were then several things that happened on the way to 1521. In 1518, Luther already sort of visited another imperial diet, although he wasn't center stage. There was a diet in Augsburg, and a cardinal who was tasked with sorting out this mess with this strange Augustinian monk saw him there, but more on the sidelines. He wasn't actually appearing in front of the emperor. He then had the famous disputation with Johannes Eck in Leipzig in 1519 in June, which was important insofar as he found himself having to admit that Jan Hus, he was tied to him. People accused him, the opposing side accused him. You are like him, and he is condemned and recognized as a heretic. So that puts you into a very bad corner. And he didn't want to admit that or say that Hus was right, even though he probably thought so. But at some point, he found himself having to do that still anyway. Then in June 1520, there was a papal bull that asked Luther to appear before the Pope within 60 days and sort of answer to questions about the things he had written and said. Otherwise, he would be excommunicated. Now, he didn't do that. In fact, in turn, he, on the 10th of December 1520, participated in an event in Wittenberg where he publicly burned that bull. And that is as close as you literally can come to burning your bridges. He also in 1520 wrote several of the crucial treatises that were to form a basic understanding of the Reformational ideals, such as on the freedom of the Christian and on the Babylonian captivity of the church, and also the open letter to the Christian nobility of the German nation. Then on the 3rd of January 1521, Luther was formally excommunicated in another papal bull. The way this worked normally, because the secular authorities cannot actually condemn somebody to be executed, that has to be done by the secular authorities, by the emperor or his representatives. Almost automatically, excommunication would have to be accompanied by the so-called Reichsact, the imperial ban, which has to be issued by the emperor. Yet in this case, that didn't happen, not straight away. And that was because there were actually several nobles, princes in Germany who supported Luther. And there was lots of toing and froing, and eventually it was agreed that Luther would be invited to the Diet of Worms, which was to take place during the first months of 1521, and given an opportunity to recant and then get around the excommunication and the imperial ban, which almost certainly would lead to him being executed. And that is the situation as he eventually goes to Worms. And this diet was a lengthy affair. It was 4 months long. It wasn't entirely about this, obviously. Luther's case was only a small item on a very, very lengthy agenda. There were other things about what if the emperor is absent, because he was also king of Spain, who would then be in charge of the empire, that would have to be his brother. There were things about taxes and all sorts of other things. So the emperor granted Luther safe conduct, but Luther knew, everybody knew what had happened to Jan Hus. And so they considered, is it worth it? Is it too risky? But Luther decided in the end to go. Luther expected, however, to have a disputation, a discussion of his views, because he was still, of course, convinced that his criticism was correct, that the Roman Church erred. The emperor and the representatives of the curia that were there, on the other hand, didn't want any discussion. That was too risky for them. They just wanted to force him to immediately say recant or else. That was something that might have happened without, as I said earlier, without the support of particularly the elector of Saxony, Frederick the Wise, also the Prince Elector of the Palatinate, and Philip of Hesse, and a few others that supported him. I don't know why this always moves on before I press anything. Sorry about that. So on 2 days, the 17th of 18th of April, 1521, Luther appears in front of the emperor and the imperial diet, all the princes. On the first day, that's a rather brief appearance, he's asked to admit that he wrote all these treatises that were the basis of his excommunication. And he asked to look at them and read out the titles, and says, yes, that's my stuff. He's then asked to recount his positions, not to dispute them, not to have a discussion. And then he asks for a day to consider his options. He's probably a bit nervous because that this is essentially his life that's at stake here. And he's given that day. He thinks about it, he talks to friends, he has a group of friends around him. Not while he faces the emperor, but outside the hall. And then when he reappears on the 18th, he argues that he can only recant if shown how he misinterpreted scripture on the one hand, and we hear that later in the piece, or through reason, by way of logical argument where he erred. Then he leaves, while he never appears again in front of the whole diet and the emperor. He stays for a few more days because there are further attempts on the side, for instance, the Archbishop of Trier, to convince him to change his mind, because it would be the easiest way out for everybody from a purely political point of view. He doesn't. He is offered all sorts of things, for instance, like the Archbishop of Trier tells him he would become the prior of an Augustinian monastery. So he tries to buy him, essentially. No way. The emperor decides to confirm his safe conduct for another 3 weeks. What had happened in the case of Jan Hus is the argument was made afterwards. He had only been granted safe conduct to get there, to come, not to leave. And that was, of course, it hadn't been put that way, or Hus certainly hadn't understood it that way. But here the emperor confirms specifically, it's another 3 weeks, you can go home, nobody will touch you, as long as you don't preach or publish anything during those 3 weeks. What then happens on the way back, on the 4th of May, he is abducted or it appears as if he's abducted. This is actually organized by the Prince Elector of Saxony. He's brought to the Wartburg, where he is going to start his famous translation of the Bible. So 500 years ago today, he already is on the Wartburg and starts growing that beard that we see on the Lucas Cranach painting. On the 25th of May, so about 2 weeks from now, 500 years back, the emperor publishes what's called the Edict of Worms. That's at the end, the very end of the last day of the Diet. And there he proclaims the imperial ban on Luther, finally. From now on, anybody who comes across him can arrest him, can kill him. He has no rights anymore. This was backdated to the 8th of May, but published on the 25th. And he could only do it then because at that point, Luther's supporters, most of them among the princes, had left Worms and wouldn't object to it anymore. And so now he did it. But at that point, Luther was safe. Now let's talk about the piece. Ludwig Meinardus is a rather unknown composer, I have to admit. Until about 3 months ago, I didn't know him or of this piece at all, really. So you see a picture of his there in the corner. He lived from 1827 to 1896. He was a composer and conductor, more a conductor than a composer, actually. He also worked as a music critic. He was not overly successful, it has to be said. He was mainly active in 4 places, in Glogau in Silesia, later in Dresden, then in Hamburg, and eventually in Bielefeld. And he has a medium-sized output of music, but apart from this piece, nothing really made major waves at any point. The libretto of Luther and Worms was written by a theologian and art historian by the name of Wilhelm Rossmann in 1867, so a few years earlier, and actually not for Meinardus. Meinardus inherited it. It was originally meant, and sorry about that again, it was originally meant for composer in Bremen, Karl Rheintaler, who conducted the premiere of Brahms's German Requiem. And he was to write an opera on this, didn't in the end, and so eventually Meinardus came across it and wrote this piece. He did so in 1871-72, and that is relevant just when the German Empire, after the successful war against France, was founded. And Wilhelm I was made the first German emperor, and Bismarck was the Reich's chancellor then. It was premiered in Weimar in 1874. It was supported by Franz Liszt, who was then, of course, one of the biggest names in the musical world. And without his support, it might not have happened. Although, it has to be said, Meinardus was known as a rather conservative composer as well as writer. And Liszt was not really representing the type of music that he would support, but he was from then on at least a friend of Liszt the person, if not necessarily of his music. Meinardus called this piece a drama about ideas, which, as he said, depicted a Luther corresponding to historical realities. Well, that's where my title comes from. So let's see how real that is. The piece turned out to be something there at the right point in time, in the right moment, in 1883, which was Luther's 400th birthday. He was born in 1483. And there was an imperial decree, it was an official thing that had to be celebrated and commemorated, certainly in the Protestant parts of Germany, but also elsewhere. And there were about 60 performances of this piece. There were also other Luther oratorios or other Luther pieces. In fact, there are several by other composers about Luther in Erfurt, Luther in Eisenach, Luther in Weimar. So wherever he went, it was worth having music about that. But Worms was the big thing. It was performed many times in Germany, but also abroad. We know of performances in Switzerland, in Geneva, in the US, in Philadelphia, and in Reval, which today is Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. However, afterwards, it didn't happen a lot. Whenever there was a major anniversary, so 1991, which is again the 400th anniversary of Worms, or 1983, which is then his 500th birthday, there were performances, but overall very few. The one recording that's available, and of which you will hear later on more extracts from it, is available on YouTube. So you can hear the entire thing easily. Just Google Luther and Worms Meinardus, and you find it easily on YouTube. Linda Maria Koldau, who wrote an article about this piece, has to say this about it. And not just about this, but about the part of the Luther commemoration of which this is part. Three aspects dominate in these popular forms of the Luther cult, integrating the oratorios into a widely used system of communication. The glorification of Luther as a national redeemer. The cult imposed upon the locales of Luther's work as a reformer, and the omnipresence of the chorale, Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, or a mighty fortress is our God, which has been called by Heinrich Heine, for instance, the Marseillaise of Protestantism, or the battle hymn of Lutherans, and features in lots of compositions as a quote, and also you will hear many references to it later on. And this piece is, as I said earlier, it's not just this single piece. There are lots of pieces like it that relate to Luther and relate to the nationalism of the time. Now, who is in it? You can see here all the characters featuring in the piece. There are many more on, as it were, the Lutheran side than on the Catholic side, which I put here in inverted commas because that's not the terminology people would have used at the time, of course. So Luther himself is a baritone, and when he meets the emperor is actually a tenor, but then the emperor was 18 at the time, very, very young. Luther was already 37. Then there is a friend of Luther's, a historical personality, Justus Jonas, who's actually the first person we meet in the oratorio. Then there is a follower. That is not a historical figure. We don't know anybody that by the name of Martha who would have been there. Katharina, a nun, who they encounter on the way to Worms in a monastery, and she absconds. She leaves it after hearing about Luther and joins the followers of Luther. Now that, of course, has to be Katharina von Bora, who was to become his wife, even though in reality he would never meet her until 1523. It was only then that she absconded from, and she and some other nuns left the monastery and then sought refuge in Wittenberg, and eventually she would marry him. Martha is, and also Katharina, actually, the female parts have not much of a role to play in the proceedings, but he needs the full quartet of soloists. He needs a soprano and an alto, because he has lots of choruses based on soloists versus the full choir. And so he needs two female voices, and that's how he gets them. And then another, or a few more historical characters, Ulrich von Hutten and Georg von Frundsberg, and Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony. They can all be sung by the same bass singer because they never appeared together, really. On the other hand, the much smaller Catholic party, Emperor Charles V, is a tenor, as I said, and his confessor, the Franciscan Jean Glapion. If you look for him in outside this oratorio, you will always find him almost always spelled with an N at the end. But here in this piece, he only has the O. That's because he's French, I guess, and in French, the N wouldn't sound anyway if you pronounce it. Then there's lots of people around them represented by the choir, pilgrims, nuns, knights, people, folk, followers of Luther and of Rome, as they are called in this. It's never Catholics, it's followers of Rome, adherents of Rome, and a boys' choir at this small number of important moments. Now, the piece has two parts, and as I said, what we listened to at the beginning is the opening of the second part. So there is a long time spent on the way to Worms, traveling to Worms, and that introduces us to the characters and introduces us also to the fears they have, what might happen to them when they get to Worms. This is actually correct insofar, or appropriate, because this was like a triumphant tour that Luther did from Wittenberg to Worms. He was very well known at the time. And when he went to Erfurt or to other places along the way, he was feted. He was actually welcomed by the citizenry. That was a big thing for them. And then the second part, which is actually a bit shorter than the first, is the actual event. He appears in Worms before the emperor and the princess, and then things unfold there. As you've seen just a moment ago, there are many more characters devoted or engaged with the Lutheran side. And Glapio is the main villain because the emperor the nationalist view of the whole thing is the emperor cannot be as bad because after all he is to represent German interests, even though he might be misguided. So someone else who's not German has to be the bad guy, and that is this confessor. We have very complex choruses, and you will hear two of them later. And we have use of Lutheran chorales. The most often, indeed, A Mighty Fortress is Our God, Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, but also three others. Two by Luther himself, which is Vom Himmel hoch, da komme ich her, from heaven above to earth I come, and Ach Gott vom Himmel sieh da rein, O God, look down from heaven. And one that was written by Justus Jonas, but also shortly afterwards. So these are all from the mid of the 1520s. Wo Gott der Herr nicht bei uns hält, where God the Lord stands with us not. And they appear repeatedly, either sometimes in the melodic lines, but actually more often as accompaniment to some melodic lines, so a bit in the background. Now let's start and look at a first extract from the first part, On the Way to Worms. And the first character we encounter is Justus Jonas, who is a bit afraid of what might happen to them in Worms and wishes that the Lord will interfere on their behalf. And he does that with these words. So let's listen to this.
Und zerstreue sie, schieß deine Strahlen und schrecke sie, schieß deine Strahlen und schrecke sie. Errette uns von der Hand der Fremden. Welcher Liebe ist kein Nütze, welcher Liebe ist kein Nütze, kein Nütze. Errette uns von der Hand der Fremden, welcher Liebe ist kein Nütze. Herr, lass blitzen, Herr, lass blitzen, Herr, lass blitzen, schieß deine Strahlen, strecke sie, errette uns von der Hand der Fremden, welche Liebe ist kein Nütze.
Okay, so this is first and foremost an example of tone painting, where the music tries to resemble in its structure something we are told. So you might think, for instance, of as a model of that in Bach's St. Matthew Passion, when Jesus dies on the cross, and there's this announcement. So there was an earthquake, and the curtain in the temple was split, and the music tries to resemble that earthquake. And here we have the lightning and flashing and destroying the bolts, and that is what these hammering orchestral beats give us. So that is one thing you get a bit here. But the other thing which I want to focus on here is this word. In German, Fremden, save us or deliver us from the hand of what is here translated as strange man. And I think here the translator wants to soften something a bit, because that's not a good translation. What this really means, and what he wanted to mean, is deliver us out of the hand of the foreigners. Strangers would also work maybe, but foreigners is really what this means. Of the non-Germans. This is a special point to be made in the 1870s and also 80s, in the newly nationalistically united and very proud German Empire. And this is, and I have a few things about, again, from Koldau's article about this. Protestantism was, she says, described as Nationalreligiosität, a term whose literal meaning is national religiosity. And she talks about this new German Empire in the late 19th century. But this conveys much more in German. The fusion of nationalism and Christian religion for political ends, widely disseminated in popular culture. Martin Luther became a German national hero who had gradually evolved from a model of German middle-class identity to a German national folk hero. He offered heroic moments of lasting symbolic power, like this one in Worms. He brought to an end, according to a Protestant perspective, an era of corruption and decadence and introduced a new era of glory and national pride. And there was often painted something like a line that led from Luther to Bismarck. So from the leader in the 16th century to this new leader in our times, as it were then. Now, the picture you see there on the right is actually later, it's from the First World War, but it's the very same idea behind it. So you see there where underneath of Luther, you say, mighty fortress is our God. And then it says there, we Germans fear God, but nothing else in the world. And that's associated with Bismarck. Another, I think, very good example of that is represented by a speech that was given by an eminent German historian at the time, Heinrich von Treitschke, in 1883, the year of the Luther anniversary, when we had the 60 performances of our Oratorio. And I've translated that here as such. A foreigner may be baffled and wonder, how can a contradiction that strange exist side by side in a single soul? That's Luther's, of course. To us as Germans, this is not a conundrum. We just say, this is blood from our blood. From deep in the eyes of this rustic peasant son, Luther again, flashed out the old bravery of the Germanic tribesman who doesn't retreat from the world, yet tries to rule it. So a bit like maybe the Germans opposing the Romans in the Teutoburg forest or something like that. So this was very much about us against them, and this is a German thing more than, almost even more maybe than a theological one, a religious one. It's one about Germans getting it right and others getting it wrong. And that is something that many texts have little things like this word Fremden that we saw earlier. So little hints of this playing a part also in this oratorio. Now the next example, it's a bit longer, although not as long as this text might you want to think. Now this is also from the first part towards the end, where the emperor's confessor, Glapio, meets Luther before they get to Worms. And he makes him an offer. You see there at the bottom that he will offer him a bishopric if he doesn't go to Worms and actually sees the error of his ways and recants. And while we listen to that, I would like you to look at the things I encircled here in black, how they are set to music. That is something that is meant to indicate the character, the false character of Glapio, who pretends to be interested in Luther's well-being, but in fact it's not. And the yellow bits down there, that's Luther's response. That is among the first appearances of the A Mighty Fortress is Our God tune. First, the first two examples in the melody that is sung, and then towards the end, the last one in the accompaniment. So let's listen to this.
Carolus, mein gnädiger Kaiser und Herr, entbeut dir Groß und Gnade, so du dich nahest als ein Mann des Friedens und der Demut. Den Kaiser ich wie mir Gott gebeugt, auch bin ich es, der den Frieden stört. Voll dir, so du dich unterwerfen kommst dem heiligen Vater und der Kirche. Die Kirche, unsere heilige Mutter, verzeihet alle ihren Sünden, so sich bekehren vom falschen Wege. Auch dir, Martine, auch dir wird sie verzeihen, wiewohl du schwer gefrevelt wiedersehen, wiewohl du einbrachst in den Weinberg. Als nein, nicht ich, nein ihr habt an Gottes Thron gestoßen, ihr habt den Herrn zum andern Male gemartert und gekreuziget, durch Trug und Menschensatzung. Denn Lebe dich weg, Tod ist mir ärgerlich. Lebe dich weg, geh weg, fort, fort, ein Tuch, Martine, kehren um. So wird man dir wohl darin Bischofsschafe, lässt das heilige Hand des Herrn weg. Sei Versucher, lebe dich weg, zu weinen wird man dir geben, lässt das heilige Hand des Fort weg, fort weg, leben verhindert, Martine, verhindert, fort hinweg, kehren, fort hinweg, kehren, fort hinweg, hinweg, fort.
Yeah, this is the only time in the first part that the Catholic side gets an outing, this event. Now, we know that Glapio tried to meet Luther beforehand in a place called Ebernburg near Worms, which actually belonged to Ulrich von Hutten. But Luther declined the invitation. He did not want to see Glapio. So that actually not take place. So this is historically not quite correct, but we need a dramatic moment to sort of prepare his arrival. So Meinardus decided, or rather Rossmann wrote the libretto to include that. But what he does here, which is this attempted bribery at the end, you might get a bishopric, is not dissimilar to what Luther experienced after his appearance in front of the Diet, when the Archbishop of Trier offered him something similar. So it's not entirely wrong, but it's sort of rejigged for dramaturgic purposes. Now, if you compare the music of the two, and particularly those bits that were encircled in black, Luther has very straight and clear lines. He is the good guy, of course, although it doesn't seem to me he's not as heroic as he could be, as a kind of a figure who sort of stands his ground. And we will hear that in a moment when we hear his most famous lines. Glapio, on the other hand, has many embellishments. Appoggiaturas, which is starting with a small note before the main note comes. Melismas, which is what happens in all those circles. You have one syllable of text stretched across many, many small notes. And that is a moment of making that artificial. He appears as sly or false this way. And we've seen that the Festburg melody, Mighty Fortress, appears in the tune, in the sung line, as well as in the accompaniment. Now let's get to the most famous moment, the climactic moment. He responds to the emperor, and here he has only one encounter with the emperor. It's not over 2 days. And he has here, in what is number 9 in the CD, in the booklet, that is his famous response. He says more. I only come in here for the bit that everybody knows, even though it's not exactly the wording that is that we know from the time that he himself conveyed. But this is the way that Rossmann put it. So let's listen to how he actually gets to his here I stand, I can do no other.
Des Herrn Wort über Menschenwort, also hab ich gelehrt.
So at the end, we have yet again the Mighty Fortress is Our God tune in the accompaniment. I find this a bit odd, actually, because if you noticed when he starts this "Here I Stand" line, actually the tune comes first in the accompaniment, and then he starts singing. And the phrase ends before he stops singing. So he finishes it unaccompanied. It's sort of out of sync. And to me, that sounds a bit odd, but that's, I'll come back later to how, what I think about him as a composer and where things work well and where I'm not so sure they do work very well. Now here, the very next thing is a response, triple chorus, as it were. There are two full choirs and then the boys' choir. The first coming in are the adherents, the followers of Rome, and they want to burn him. You see here the line is not very long, it's repeated over and over again. So put him at the stake and burn him. And then the followers of Luther respond. Now this was the crucial moment. We have now turned away from the Pope, from the wrong Pope, and Luther had the year before started calling the Pope actually the Antichrist. We now return to the real Pope, that is actually Christ himself, and that's what they say throughout here. And they do this using another hymn tune, another chorale, Vom Himmel hoch, da komm ich her. And you will hear that emerging, particularly when the boys sing it. The boys, because they're rather weak, being boys in dynamics, they sing just in unison, and they are usually supported by the brass or major parts of the orchestra. So when they sing, you hear that. But otherwise, it's very not chaotic, but it's meant to be a bit sort of like a musical battle between the two sides in a very polyphonic structure. So each side sings their text in imitation. So one starts with the phrase and the other three parts follow one by one, and the counter, the opposing side does the same. So that's very complex. And these are actually the most interesting bits of the entire composition. So let's listen to this chorus. So Luther's response, again, like his previous exchange with Glapio, that's not very heroic or dramatic. He doesn't appear to be much perturbed or anxious. He's very calm, he's very self-assured, and that he is throughout the entire piece. As I said, I'm not so sure that the Festival quotation at the end of his lines there works extremely well with this because it's out of sync. And then we have this battle focusing on the Vom Himmel hoch tune versus the adherents of Rome. That reminds me a bit the whole thing. There's this battle in Elijah between the priests of Baal and Elijah, who can actually gets his god to light a pyre of wood. And then it's not two choruses, but I think there's something like that a little bit. He certainly clearly sometimes tries to sound a bit like Mendelssohn. He also sometimes tries to go back and take sort of a model from Bach's Passions or Oratorios. Now, afterwards, after his confrontation with the emperor, we have the two female characters who are not historical figures that would have been there at the time. Katharina would only meet him 2 years later, and Martha is not really it's more like one of these characters in Bach Passions like Daughter of Zion or so who represents a principle rather than a specific historical character. So Katharina responds, and sort of is probably meant to be like the view of the audience. It's saying what we are meant to think or feel in response to it. But then we see what Luther does after she has sung. And that is, again, something not very historical. So what happened here, this is the immediate response to the emperor now announcing the imperial ban on Luther. And this is it's not historically correct because, as I said earlier, this only happened 4 weeks later after Luther had actually left Worms, not into his face. But what's even stranger here is that Luther responds with a ban of his own, Now you are banning me. Now listen, banned be the law that is death to life. Banned be the letter that dampens the spirit. Banned be the formula that throws. So everything that in his view Rome stands for. And that didn't happen. And if he had tried something like that, he probably really wouldn't have left the place alive. So this is, however, from a dramatic point of view, a very good juxtaposition, sort of, you do this, how I can best you. And next we get Martha talking about Luther. Let's listen to that. So, and this, the last bit that Martha sings, it is at the bottom here, the last bullet point, that of course is tailored after the Beatitudes from the Sermon of the Mount. Blessed are these, those, and the others. Now here it's not, there it's Jesus saying it about others, but here she is saying it about Luther. So there is a trend, and we've seen that before, of creating a parallel between Jesus and Luther. Not saying he is God, of course, but he plays a part to us. He's as important to us as Jesus might have been to the people then. So we had earlier the temptation scene where Gladio offers him a bishopric, which is a bit like Jesus being tempted by the devil. And then he says at the end, Luther that is, so go away, so stop tempting me. We also have something like a Gethsemane scene, which we haven't heard now, when Ulrich von Hutten offers Luther the armed support of the Reichsritter, the imperial knights. And the words Luther uses to refuse that, no, not like this, noble knights, dear sirs. If God wanted to intervene, legions of angels would be standing ready for him, which is of course exactly much what Jesus says to St. Peter when he tries to, with his sword, to prevent his arrest. There would be legions of angels that would be fighting for me if that was the point. And so Hutten then responds, truly it's God's spirit that speaks from him, from Luther. And also the very presence of someone called Martha, the choice of this name for this allegorical character. There is, of course, a biblical Martha, the sister of Mary of Bethany and also of Lazarus, who is a follower of Jesus. So there are links, I think, where there is a conscious attempt to paint Luther, to depict Luther in a way to make him a Jesus-like figure, not a God, but someone who's important to the people at the time. And she calls him prophet, of course. She doesn't call him God, she calls him a prophet. So just to go back there, that's actually a line that's missing in English. Sorry, there's a line haven't been forgotten. There are three blesseds. Selig wir, die wir den Propheten schauen. Blessed are we who are witnessing the prophet. That's missing in the English. But it's also a kind of a conscious juxtaposition where it says he bans. So Luther banned, and then Martha blessed. So everyone else is on the bad side, on the dark side. They are banned, and we are blessed with you. So Katharina comments like an allegorical character. Luther has this ban of his own. What you may have noticed is that is a nice way of creating intensity. The musical lines, when he announces this ban, so banned be this and that and the other, it always goes up a semitone, the highest note of each line. And so that creates tension and creates intensity and makes it more dramatic. It's unhistorical because too early, and Luther's ban is unhistorical because never happened. Now I have one more music example, but I want to conclude with that. So some final thoughts now. Unlike of what Meinardus said, this is not really a Luther corresponding to historical reality, because he is painted from the point of view of a German nationalistic attitude that wants to celebrate Luther as a German, first and foremost, who stood up to foreigners who imposed their wrong views on the Germans. Now, there is very little we learn in this piece about theology. There's nothing about justification or indulgences or anything. It's all about the dramatic clash between them. It is, however, I would say, a drama of ideas between those two sides. So Luther is really more a German of the 19th than of the 16th century, or let's say the entire scenery is, insofar as there is the Pope and the Roman Curia is foreign first and foremost, and the German nation has to get rid of them because the Germans know best how to deal with all these things, theological or secular. What's interesting is, and you probably noticed that, and I said that a few times, Luther himself doesn't sound like a heroic warrior against the Pope or something like that. He's very lyrical, very self-assured, very calm. If there's anything like drama, it's more in the choruses and a little bit in some of the solo parts, but not very much. It's particularly in the choruses, the one you have heard and the one you are about to hear in a moment. And that is the reason why I think it is most interesting, this piece, in terms of its choruses. The solo sections are sometimes rather strange, and I try to pick you the most interesting bits. So if you have time, maybe listen to the entire thing on YouTube at some point. He was criticized as a composer, and the main thing where I wonder is his writing of melodies. The thing is, if you write a melody in the tonal style in which it is set, you are to, it has to give you the impression it couldn't be any other way. It is really flowing in a natural way. And very often, particularly not when Luther sings, but the others, like the Katharina and Martha bits we just listened to. Yeah, the notes always fit into the harmony. Of course, they have to, but I don't get the idea that there couldn't be another note at that point. It sounds sometimes a bit random how the melody progresses, and to me, not that convincing, whereas the choruses are much stronger that way. And some of the solo parts as well, like Luther's own, particularly when he confronts the emperor with his "Here I Stand" an announcement. So there's a bit of an inconsistent approach to dramatic effects, actually both in the score and in the production here as well, this particular recording, which is the only one available, so we can't really criticize it. But it's the singers that they have don't seem to have much of a dynamic range. There are moments in the score where there's a fortissimo and really now you thunder it out, but there isn't much thundering. Most thundering is done by the orchestra, not so much by the soloists. The orchestra is actually much more emotive. There's much more dynamic change and playing with colors of sounds than there is in the vocal parts. I have a feeling there is something where he feels more inspired in some sections or some ways of writing where he's not that inspired. So let's finish now with the final chorus. Again, like in the previous examples with the Vom Himmel hoch tune, we have three choirs, but now they are all unified. They're all on Luther's side. But it's still, we have the soloists coming in first, Luther alone, with the tune, Ein feste Burg, a mighty fortress again. Now, unlike on previous occasions, in the old rhythm, which is a kind of a syncopated dotted rhythm. He starts alone and without orchestral accompaniment, and then other soloists join him until it's a quintet. And then eventually the choir joins, so it's a double chorus then. And then the boys come in as well, and there are 3 sections. It is, again, very much polyphonic, very much with imitative entries. And only in the third and final section, you will hear that it turns homophonic. They all sing the same text at the same time, which makes it much easier to understand. According to Christa Kleinschmidt, who wrote a book, a biography of Meinardus, this idea of starting with Luther alone and then spreading to the soloists and the choir and everybody symbolizes the gradual expansion of the faith, of the Lutheran faith after the Diet of Worms. So this is the longest example, but I think it's also probably the best piece of music in here.
Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott. Ein gute Wehr und Waffen. Hilf uns frei aus
Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Lutheran Church, thank you very much, Wolfgang, for this extraordinary webinar and guiding us into the spirit of the 19th century. So that it was impressive. And now we do have some time to raise questions. So if you have a question, unmute yourself and raise it. We are not so many people, so I think we don't need the chat function. Just we try if we could handle this.
Yeah, also maybe if you could just share your views of the piece, what you make of it, how much do you like it, or what do you think is interesting about it, or maybe not so interesting? Because of course I have my views, but they're just mine, personal ones. So how impressive or do you think it is? Nobody wants to start. I know that from my classes.
Okay, I'll be brave. I very much appreciated the explanations because particularly if there is music with a libretto in a language with which you're not familiar, it's extremely difficult to, I find it difficult to engage with it. I mean, I get an effect, but I don't see behind it what original audience would have seen. So I very much appreciated the clarifications which you gave and putting it into a context. So for that, I am grateful. I am very grateful.
Thank you. Do you like it as a piece of music, regardless of the content, let's say?
Well, the music was pleasant, but you not of the first order.
Mm.
Yeah, I must say I had the same idea. I feared it would be worse, but the issue is he kind of is looking back to Mendelssohn, I think, very much. And Mendelssohn used to look back to Bach, of course. So there is a sort of a link that way back, and he doesn't dare to deviate harmonically, and he can't write any good tunes, as you say. The best situation is when he uses the chorales, you know, because the tune is given. That's the best. And then even at the end, he doesn't use, for instance, he has this, the Reich is ihm, soll ihm doch bleiben, also this Reich, he could make a lot more out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Yeah, but what I was missing overall is like when you have a figure like Luther used in a totally different context to make him a German hero. Yeah, I would have expected some kind of German musical connotations, and I didn't really find them. You know, Bach, Mendelssohn, yeah, but none that would bring the German national ideas forward.
And he does one thing that's actually a bit fun. The thing is more or less through composed. That means for every new phrase of text, he writes a new melody. He doesn't have many internal repetitions of something that we could hang on to, except that's more at that moment when Luther makes his stand before the emperor. There is one tune, and that's actually also the best tune that I think Luther gets, that is recognizable. Otherwise, it's very, what Wagner does, who invents this kind of thing or makes it popular, is he has done other ways of creating unity and putting things together by way of those leitmotifs that are underneath in the orchestra. There's no such thing here. There's actually a very thin orchestra. And so it doesn't have what the past had, but it has nothing else to replace it with either. And then so it flows along, and it has its moments, and I try to pick those, but it also has many other moments when it doesn't really, it's not bowling me over. But it is an interesting example of how the time reflected on Luther and how that sort of translates into a piece of music. And there were lots of pieces like that. There's actually, I announced this event yesterday on Facebook, and colleagues of mine, musicologists and German ones in England, or one also in the US, told me they once read about, and there were actually lots of oratorios, not just about Luther, but about Gutenberg and about Hus and about other people. And that was a big thing, not least because there were lots of choral societies. That was a big thing for the bourgeois society, and they all needed pieces. They wanted new pieces. And so a lot of that stuff was written for that market. And it was performed, and some of it stayed and some of it didn't. And this one had its moment because it hit the mark in 1883, but beyond that, it didn't last much longer. Well, if you have time, I recommend maybe try and listen to more of it on YouTube. Let it run in the background or so. Okay, then I'd say thank you very much again. Thanks for coming along and lasting all the time. This was actually longer than I thought, but that happens to me regularly. And so apologies for that. But thank you again, and I might see you in the church or elsewhere, now that it's open again.
So thank you again.
Thank you.
And if you like, next Monday we have a third webinar. It is during the German coffee morning, starting at 11 a.m. about the music of Emperor Karl V, the music of his time, and Werner Blau will be our lecturer. So nice evening to all of you, and thank you very much.